Life can be overwhelming. There are moments when the weight of trials feels unbearable, when prayers seem unanswered, and when hope appears distant. Maybe right now, you're walking through a storm, wondering if God sees you, if He hears your cries, if He's still working in the midst of your struggle. The silence can be deafening, and the waiting can feel endless. But what if I told you that God is not absent? What if, in the very place where you feel abandoned, He is doing His greatest work? This message is for the weary, for the ones who have fought battles in silence, for those who have questioned whether they have the strength to keep going. You are not alone. Your suffering is not in vain. God is moving in ways you cannot yet see, and He is about to reveal Himself in the most powerful way. Through the fire, through the storm, through the very struggle that threatens to break you, He is shaping you, strengthening you, and preparing you for something greater than you can imagine. Stay with me, because by the end of this message, you will see your pain differently. You will realize that what feels like an ending is actually the setup for a testimony that will not only change your life, but inspire and strengthen others. God is not finished with you. He is right there in the midst of your struggle, and He is about to show you why. One of the greatest temptations in suffering is to believe that God has abandoned us. When trials come, when prayers seem unanswered, when the silence of heaven weighs heavily upon our hearts, we begin to wonder if God has turned His face away. The enemy whispers lies, sowing seeds of doubt. If God loved you, would He allow this? If He were truly near, would you be suffering like this? But these are the same lies spoken since the beginning of time, the same deception whispered to Job as he sat in his ashes, the same doubts that clouded the minds of the disciples as they watched their Lord crucified. Yet the truth is unshaken. God's presence is not proven by the absence of suffering, nor is His love diminished by our hardships. Scripture is filled with the accounts of God's people walking through seasons of struggle, yet never forsaken. When Joseph was betrayed by his brothers and thrown into a pit, when he languished in an Egyptian prison for years, did that mean God had abandoned him? No. The hand of the Almighty was guiding him, even through betrayal, injustice, and waiting. The Lord was with Joseph. Scripture declares, not when he sat upon the throne of Egypt, but when he was enslaved, Genesis 39:2. The presence of suffering did not mean the absence of God. Rather, it was the very place where God's hand was working most powerfully. The Israelites too faced this testing. Delivered from Egypt, led by the mighty hand of God, they found themselves trapped between the sea and the advancing armies of Pharaoh. Panic set in. Fear took hold. Did this mean that God had led them out only to abandon them? No. At that very moment when all seemed lost, the Lord parted the waters, making a way where there was none. What they perceived as abandonment was in truth the setting for their greatest deliverance. Even the prophets, chosen and anointed by God, walked through fires of affliction. Elijah, after calling down fire from heaven, found himself pursued by Jezebel, fleeing into the wilderness, overwhelmed with despair. Did his suffering mean that God had left him? No. In that moment when he felt most alone, the Lord met him, not in the wind, not in the earthquake, not in the fire, but in the gentle whisper. God had never left him. He was closer than Elijah had realized. But the greatest proof of all is found in the cross of Christ. When the Son of God hung upon that tree, when darkness covered the land, when he cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Was the Father absent? No. In that moment, though unseen to human eyes, the greatest act of redemption was unfolding. What appeared to be defeat was the very means by which victory was secured. If Christ himself, the sinless one, endured suffering, yet remained in the perfect will of the Father, how much more should we trust that our trials do not mean we have been forsaken? God does not measure his nearness by ease, nor his love by comfort. He is present in our pain, working all things together for good, even when we cannot yet see it. Suffering is not a meaningless burden nor an accident in the life of a believer. It is not simply an unfortunate event we must endure. It is a tool in the hands of a sovereign God. If we belong to him, then nothing we experience is wasted. Every trial, every hardship, every moment of pain is allowed by divine wisdom and infused with divine purpose. God does not simply permit suffering, he uses it. He shapes us through it, refining our character, strengthening our faith, and drawing us closer to him. From the beginning, Scripture has revealed that God's way is often one of refining, not of ease. The process of sanctification is not instant, it is a journey through fire. Just as a blacksmith heats raw metal in the flames, hammering it into shape, removing impurities and strengthening its core, so too does God work within us. The fire of suffering is not meant to destroy us, but to purify us. In 1 Peter 1, 6-7, we are told that trials come so that our faith, more precious than gold, may be tested and refined, proving its genuineness. The refining process is painful, but without it, the impurities of pride, self-reliance, and doubt remain. Consider the life of Job, a man of great faith, wealth, and prosperity, yet God allowed him to be tested in ways few could bear. He lost his children, his health, and his possessions, yet through his suffering a deeper revelation of God was granted to him. Before his trials, Job knew of God, but afterward he said, "My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you." Job 42:5. Suffering stripped away all that was temporary and left him with an unshakable knowledge of the Almighty. The same is true for us. There are aspects of God's character that we only come to understand through suffering. There are depths of his presence that are only revealed in the valley, never on the mountaintop. Even the apostles, those chosen by Christ, were not exempt from suffering. Paul, a man used mightily by God, endured beatings, shipwrecks, imprisonment, and betrayal. Yet he did not see these as curses, but as a means by which God was shaping him. He declared that suffering produces endurance, character, and hope. Without trials, endurance is never developed. Without hardship, faith is never strengthened. Without suffering, the heart never truly learns to cling to God above all else. Jesus himself, though perfect and without sin, walked the path of suffering. He learned obedience through what he suffered. Hebrews 5:8. If even the Son of God was shaped by trials, how much more should we expect that suffering will play a role in our transformation? Christ was not spared the agony of the cross, yet through it salvation was accomplished. In the same way, though we long for ease, God's greatest work in us often comes through our deepest pain. We may not always understand why suffering comes, but we can be certain of this: God does not waste our pain. Every hardship, every moment of loss, and every tear shed is shaping us into the image of Christ. The fire may be fierce, but we are not being consumed. We are being refined. God is not punishing us. He is preparing us. One of the greatest struggles we face in times of hardship is the waiting. We cry out to God for deliverance, for healing, for answers, and yet so often his response is not immediate. It is in this waiting that faith is tested and doubt creeps in. We question whether God hears us, whether he sees our suffering, whether he truly cares. But Scripture reveals a powerful truth. God's timing is never late, never early, but always perfect. His delays are not denials, they are divine appointments designed for a greater purpose than we can yet see. The story of Abraham teaches us this lesson. God promised him a son, a legacy as vast as the stars, Yet years passed, and no child came. Human reasoning suggested that time was running out, that God's promise had been forgotten. Sarah, in her impatience, took matters into her own hands, leading to Ismael's birth, a decision that brought turmoil instead of fulfillment. But when the time was right, God fulfilled his promise, and Isaac was born. What seemed like a delay was not a failure on God's part, but the outworking of his perfect plan. The lesson is clear. Waiting on God's timing is always better than rushing ahead with our own solutions. Consider the Israelites in Egypt. For 400 years they cried out under the weight of slavery. Generation after generation longed for deliverance, but heaven seemed silent. Yet God had not forgotten his people. At the right moment he raised up Moses, performed mighty wonders, and led them out with power. Had he acted earlier, they would not have witnessed the miracles that proved his glory. Had he acted later, they might have been utterly crushed. His timing was precise, accomplishing far more than just physical freedom. It was a testimony for all generations of his power and faithfulness. Even in the life of Christ, we see this truth. When Lazarus fell sick, his sisters sent for Jesus, expecting him to come immediately. But he delayed, and Lazarus died. To them, it seemed like he had arrived too late. Their hope was buried in the tomb along with their brother. But when Jesus came, he did not merely heal Lazarus. He raised him from the dead. The delay was not neglect, it was divine purpose. Through waiting, a greater miracle was revealed. When we are in the midst of suffering, when our prayers seem unanswered and our hearts grow weary in waiting, we must remember that God sees the full picture. He is never idle, never indifferent. What we perceive as delays are often his preparations, aligning circumstances, refining our hearts, and orchestrating something greater than we imagined. His ways are higher than ours, and his timing is always right. We may not understand it now, but one day we will look back and see that he was working all along, and his perfect timing brought about something far greater than our impatient hearts could have ever conceived. Weakness is something we often try to avoid. We fear it, hide it, and see it as a flaw. The world tells us that strength means independence, control, and self-sufficiency, but God's ways are not our ways. In his kingdom, weakness is not a liability, it is the very place where his power is revealed. When we are at our lowest, when our own strength is gone, when we have nothing left to offer, that is when God moves in ways beyond our understanding. His power is made perfect not in our abilities, but in our surrender. The Apostle Paul understood this deeply. He was a man of great intellect and passion, yet he was given a thorn in the flesh, a weakness he repeatedly asked God to remove. But God's answer was not what he expected. My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. 2 Corinthians 12:9. Instead of removing the struggle, God used it to demonstrate his sufficiency. Paul learned that true strength does not come from within, but from absolute dependence on Christ. He even rejoiced in his weakness, because it was there that Christ's power rested upon him. The story of Gideon is another powerful example. When God called him to lead Israel against the Midianites, Gideon saw himself as weak and unqualified. He was the least in his family, and his family was the weakest in their tribe. Yet God deliberately chose him, not because of his might, but because his strength would be displayed through Gideon's inadequacy. Even after assembling an army, God reduced Gideon's forces from thousands to just 300 men, so that victory would clearly be by God's hand, not human effort. When the battle was won, there was no doubt. God alone had done it. Consider also Moses, a man called to deliver Israel but burdened by insecurity. He protested, saying he was slow of speech and unable to lead. But God did not remove his weakness. Instead, he promised, I will be with you. Moses' weakness did not disqualify him, it positioned him to rely entirely on God's strength. Through this dependence, God performed mighty miracles and led a nation to freedom. Even Jesus, in his humanity, embraced weakness. Though fully God, he chose to take on flesh, to suffer, to hunger, to grow weary. In the Garden of Gethsemane, he felt the weight of suffering and cried out to the Father. On the cross, he was at his weakest, seemingly defeated, yet in that moment, the greatest victory was won. His resurrection proved that God's power triumphs over every weakness, every suffering, and even death itself. When we are weak, when we feel unworthy, when we have nothing left to give, that is the moment God steps in. His grace is not just enough, it is overflowing. The more we recognize our weakness, the more we will experience His strength. What the world sees as failure, God sees as an opportunity for His glory to shine. Our limitations do not hinder God. They invite Him to move in ways beyond what we could ever achieve on our own. There are seasons in life when we find ourselves in the midst of fiery trials, when pain, loss, and hardship seem overwhelming. These are the moments when faith is tested, when our hearts cry out for relief, and when we may wonder if God has left us to suffer alone. But Scripture reveals a profound and unshakable truth. God does not stand at a distance while we walk through the fire. He walks with us, sustains us, and reveals His presence in ways we could never experience otherwise. One of the clearest examples of this is found in the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These three young men refused to bow to King Nebuchadnezzar's golden statue, standing firm in their devotion to God, even when threatened with death. The king, enraged by their defiance, ordered them to be thrown into a fiery furnace, heated 7 times hotter than usual. It was a trial beyond human endurance, a moment when all hope seemed lost, but then something miraculous happened. As the king looked into the flames, he saw not 3 men, but 4, walking unharmed in the fire. The 4th, he declared, looked like a son of the gods, Daniel 3:25. The fire that was meant to destroy them became the very place where the presence of God was revealed. They were not alone, and neither are we. God's presence in the fire is not limited to miraculous deliverance. Sometimes He does not remove the suffering, but He sustains us through it. The Israelites, as they wandered in the wilderness, were guided by a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. That fire was not a consuming blaze, but a guiding light, reminding them that God was with them every step of the way. In the same way, when we walk through trials, God does not leave us in darkness. His presence may not always be visible, but it is always there, leading, strengthening, and comforting. Even the greatest heroes of faith experienced suffering, yet in their trials they encountered the nearness of God. David, a man after God's own heart, spent years fleeing from Saul, hiding in caves, crying out in desperation. Yet in those moments of despair he penned some of the most powerful psalms, declaring, "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me." Psalm 23:04. The valley was not removed, but God's presence in it gave him courage and peace. Jesus himself, in his time on earth, did not avoid suffering. He entered fully into human pain, experiencing sorrow, betrayal, and even death. On the cross, he bore the weight of the world's sin, and in that moment of agony he cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Yet even in that darkness, the Father's plan was unfolding. Jesus' suffering was not meaningless. It was the means by which salvation was accomplished. If God did not abandon His Son, but used His suffering for the greatest purpose in history, we can trust that He will do the same in our lives. There are times when we long for deliverance, when we plead for God to take away the suffering, and yet the fire remains. But the promise we cling to is this: the fire will not consume us. Isaiah 43:2 declares, "When you walk through the fire, you will not be burned. The flames will not set you ablaze." The trials we face are not the end of our story. They are the places where God's power is displayed, where our faith is refined, and where we come to know Him in ways we never could otherwise. The presence of the fire does not mean God has abandoned us. It is often in the fire that we see Him most clearly. Struggles can feel overwhelming, like a weight too heavy to bear. In the midst of suffering, it is easy to wonder if there is any purpose in the pain. But the truth is, God never wastes our struggles. What seems like a season of brokenness, hardship, or defeat is often the very thing God uses to display His power and faithfulness. He turns trials into testimonies, transforming pain into a story of His glory. The Bible is filled with stories of people who endured great suffering, yet through their struggles God revealed His faithfulness. Joseph was sold into slavery by his own brothers, falsely accused and thrown into prison for years. It seemed as if his life had been shattered beyond repair. But God was not done. What appeared to be suffering without purpose was actually the path to Joseph's destiny. When the time was right, God elevated him to the highest position in Egypt, and he became the instrument of salvation for an entire nation. Looking back, Joseph declared to his brothers, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good." His suffering became the testimony of God's power to redeem even the darkest situations. Job is another example of how struggle leads to testimony. He lost everything: his wealth, his health, his children. His friends accused him, and his own wife told him to give up. Yet in the end, God restored Job and blessed him even more than before. His story was not just about suffering, it was about perseverance, trust, and ultimately the faithfulness of God. Today, Job's testimony continues to inspire millions who walk through seasons of pain. The greatest testimony of all comes through Jesus Christ. His suffering on the cross, His rejection, humiliation, and death seemed like the ultimate defeat. But what the enemy meant for destruction, God used for the salvation of the world. The resurrection turned the greatest struggle into the greatest victory. Because of His suffering, we have redemption, and because of His triumph, we have hope. Our own struggles, though painful, are not the end of our story. When we trust God through our trials, He uses them to reveal His faithfulness not only to us, but to others. Our suffering allows us to speak from experience, to tell others that God is a healer, a provider, a deliverer, because we have seen Him work in our own lives. Every scar we carry becomes a testimony of His grace. Paul understood this deeply when he wrote, "Praise be to the God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our troubles, so that we can comfort those in any trouble with the comfort we ourselves receive from God." 2 Corinthians 1:3-4. The struggles we endure are not just for us. God turns them into testimonies that encourage others, proving that He is still working, still moving, and still faithful. What the enemy meant for harm, God will use for His glory. In every struggle, in every season of suffering, God is not distant. He is actively working. He shapes us through trials, refines us through fire, and strengthens us in weakness. His timing is never late, and His power is revealed when we have nothing left to rely on but Him. The hardships we endure are not meaningless. They are the very places where God's presence is made known. He walks with us through the storm. He upholds us in the fire, and in the end He turns our pain into a testimony of His faithfulness. What seems like a moment of defeat is often the very thing He uses to bring victory. So, if you find yourself in a season of struggle, Hold on to this truth. God is at work. He has not abandoned you. He is molding you, preparing you, and drawing you closer to Him. The pain you feel today will one day become the testimony that strengthens others. Trust Him, lean into His presence, and know that in His perfect time, He will reveal the purpose behind your struggle. Thank you for your time and for allowing me to share this message with you. May you walk forward with renewed faith, knowing that your struggles are not the end of your story. They are the place where God's power will be revealed. God bless you.